Hey guys, we are reading chapter 22 of The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and this chapter is called The Procession. It picks up exactly where chapter 21 left off. At the end of 21, Chillingworth was smiling at Hester across the marketplace, and that is where 22, as I said, picks up. Remember, it is election day. Before Hester Prynne could call together her thoughts and consider what was practicable to be done in this new and startling aspect of affairs, the sound of military music was heard approaching along a contiguous street. It denoted the advance of the procession of magistrates and citizens on its way towards the meeting house, where, in compliance with a custom thus early established, and ever since observed, the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale was to deliver an election sermon. Soon the head of the procession showed itself with a slow and stately march, turning a corner and making its way across the marketplace. First came the music. It comprised a variety of instruments, perhaps imperfectly adapted to one another, and played with no great skill, but yet attaining the great object for which the harmony of drum and clarion addresses itself to the multitude, that of imparting a higher and more heroic air to the scene of life that passes before the eye. Little Pearl at first clapped her hands, but then lost for an instant the restless agitation that had kept her in a continual effervescence throughout the morning. She gazed silently and seemed to be borne upward like a floating sea-bird on the long heaves and swells of sound. But she was brought back to her former mood by the shimmer of the sunshine on the weapons and bright armor of the military company, which followed after the music and formed the honorary escort of the procession. This body of soldiery, which still sustains a corporate existence and marches down from past ages with an ancient and honorable fame, was composed of no mercenary materials. Its ranks were filled with gentlemen who felt the stirrings of martial impulse and sought to establish a kind of college of arms, whereas in an association of Knights Templars, they might learn the science and, so far as peaceful exercise would teach them, the practices of war. The high estimation then placed upon the military character might be seen in the lofty port of each individual member of the company. Some of them, indeed, by their services in the Low Countries and on other fields of warfare, had fairly won their title to assume the name and pomp of soldiership. The entire array, moreover, clad in burnished steel and with plumage nodding over their bright morions, had a brilliancy of effect which no modern display can aspire to equal. Okay, so here in the beginning, Hawthorne, or our narrator, is just explaining the parade, the procession. It starts with the band, which isn't especially good, but it still manages to make the event seem important. And then right behind them, you have the soldiers, and the soldiers are dressed up. These are not, it says they were of no mercenary materials. Most of them are men who haven't necessarily seen battle. It's a lot of gentlemen who kind of felt like they should join in. So they're dressed really nicely, really kind of fancy soldier uniforms. And yet the men of civil eminence who came immediately behind the military escort were better worth a thoughtful observer's eye. Even in outward demeanor, they showed a stamp of majesty that made the warrior's haughty stride look vulgar, if not absurd. It was an age when what we call talent had far less consideration than now, but the massive materials which produce stability and dignity of character a great deal more. The people possessed, by hereditary right, the quality of reverence which in their descendants, if it survive at all, exists in smaller proportion and with a vastly diminished force in the selection and estimate of public men. The change may be for good or for ill, and is partly perhaps for both. In that old day, the English settler on these rude shores, having left king, nobles, and all degrees of awful rank behind, while still the faculty and necessity of reverence were strong in him, bestowed it on the white hair and venerable brow of age, on long-tried integrity, on solid wisdom and sad-colored experience, on endowments of that grave and weighty order which gives the idea of permanence and comes under the general definition of respectability. These primitive statesmen, therefore, Bradstreet, Endicott, Dudley, Bellingham, and their compeers, who were elevated to power by the early choice of the people, seem to have been not often brilliant, but distinguished by a ponderous sobriety rather than activity of intellect. They had fortitude, self-reliance, and in time of difficulty or peril stood up for the welfare of the state like a line of cliffs against a tempestuous tide. The traits of character here indicated were well represented in the square cast of the countenance and large physical development of the new colonial magistrates. So far as a demeanor of natural authority was concerned, the mother country need not have been ashamed to see these foremost men of an actual democracy adopted into the House of Peers or made the Privy Council of the sovereign. Okay, so again, we had the band and then the soldiers, and now we have the men of civil eminence. So these are like the leaders of the town, the governor, and the politicians, basically. And then you also have some commentary from Hawthorne or from our narrator about the Puritans and how they chose their leaders. And it said that they chose men who were older and wiser and who had a lot of experience, not necessarily men of the most intellect. So they weren't intellectuals, not necessarily the most educated. They chose men who they thought could or would stay calm in an emergency or in a serious situation, that they would be able to handle it and be unbothered. So those are the kind of guys that are going through the procession. Next, we have the divine, which would be the reverends, including Dimmesdale. Next in order to the magistrates came the young and eminently distinguished divine, from whose lips the religious discourse of the anniversary was expected. His was the profession at that era in which intellectual ability displayed itself far more than in political life, for leaving a higher motive out of the question it offered leaving higher motive out of the question, it offered inducements powerful enough in the almost worshipping respect of the community to win the most aspiring ambition into its service. Even political power, as is the case of Increase Mather, was within the grasp of a successful priest. So again, this is more commentary from our narrator, just talking about the fact that ministers were usually more intellectual than the politicians, and that ministers who were successful would also gain a lot of political power. And that has to do with the fact that Puritans had a theocracy and they based their law on things that are in the Bible. So they really would have looked to those religious men for guidance. Now it's going to describe Dimmesdale, and there's been quite a change in him, and everyone's noticing. So you will want to include those changes in your notes and which characters point out the change. It was the observation of those who beheld him now that never, since Mr. Dimmesdale first set his foot on the New England shore, had he exhibited such energy as was seen in the gait and air with which he kept his pace in the procession. There was no feebleness of step, as at other times. His frame was not bent, nor did his hand rest ominously upon his heart. Yet if the clergyman were rightly viewed, his strength seemed not of the body. It might be spiritual, and imparted to him by angelic ministrations. It might be the exhilaration of that potent cordial, which is distilled only in the furnace glow of earnest and long-continued thought. Or perchance his sensitive temperament was invigorated by the loud and piercing music that swelled heavenward and uplifted him on its ascending wave. Nevertheless, so abstracted was his look, it might be questioned whether Mr. Dimmesdale even heard the music. There was his body, moving onward, and with an unaccustomed force. But where was his mind? Far and deep in its own region, busying itself with preternatural activity, to marshal a procession of stately thoughts that were soon to issue thence. And so he saw nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing of what was around him. But the spiritual element took up the feeble frame and carried it along unconscious of the burden, and converting it to spirit like itself. Men of uncommon intellect who have grown morbid possess this occasional power of mighty effort, into which they throw the life of many days and then are lifeless for as many more. Okay, so how is he different? Well, he's full of energy still. Like when he returned from the forest, he's invigorated. The people have never seen him look this good. As you know, he's like marching in the parade. It's like he doesn't see anything or hear anything. He's just lost in his own thoughts. So these changes aren't just in his body, but also in his spirit. He seems different. He's especially focused, so much so that he doesn't even seem like he's really part of what's going on around him here on election day. Now, Hester's going to notice it without a doubt and see how she takes it. Hester Prynne, gazing steadfastly at the clergyman, felt a dreary influence come over her, but wherefore or whence she knew not, and Leslie seemed so remote from her own sphere and utterly beyond her reach. One glance of recognition, she had imagined, must needs pass between them. She thought of the dim forest with its little dell of solitude and love and anguish, and the mossy tree trunk, where sitting hand in hand they had mingled their sad and passionate talk with the melancholy murmur of the brook. How deeply had they known each other then? And was this the man? She hardly knew him now. He, moving proudly past, enveloped as it were in the rich music, with the procession of majestic and venerable fathers. He, so unattainable in his worldly position, and still more so in that far vista of his unsympathizing thoughts, through which she now beheld him. Her spirit sank with the idea that all must have been a delusion, and that vividly as she had dreamed it, there could be no real bond betwixt the clergyman and herself, and thus much of woman was there in Hester that she could scarcely forgive him. Least of all now, when the heavy footstep of their approaching fate might be heard nearer, 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 for being able so completely to withdraw himself from their mutual world, while she groped darkly and stretched forth her cold hands and found him not. Okay, so when he goes marching by Hester, she's expecting not much, but at least a look. It says one glance of recognition must needs pass between them. That's what she expected to get. Instead, it's like he's in a completely different world. And of course, she's disappointed. Her spirit sank. It goes on to say that she can hardly forgive him for this situation. Like, they're supposed to be leaving tomorrow. All she needs is that little bit of reassurance, just that glance that tells her that, okay, we're on the same page, we're on the same team. And she doesn't get that. And so she's maybe a little bit angry, but definitely disappointed. She's not even sure that this is the same guy. He looks so different than when she saw him in the forest. She's not the only one who noticed. Pearl either saw and responded to her mother's feelings or herself felt the remoteness and intangibility that had fallen around the minister. While the procession passed, the child was uneasy, fluttering up and down like a bird on the point of taking flight. When the whole had gone by, she looked up into Hester's face. "Mother," said she, "was that the same minister that kissed me by the brook?" "Hold thy peace, dear little Pearl," whispered her mother. "We must not always talk in the marketplace of what happens to us in the forest." "I could not be sure that it was he, so strange he looked," continued the child. "Else I would have run to him and bid him kiss me now before all the people, even as he did yonder among the dark old trees. What would the minister have said, mother? Would he have clapped his hand over his heart and scowled on me and bid me begone?" "What should he say, Pearl?" answered Hester, "save that it was no time to kiss, and that kisses are not to be given in the marketplace. Well for thee, foolish child, that thou didst not speak to him." Okay, so Pearl also noticed he looked different. She even questions, is that the same guy? Because she's not so sure. Another shade of the same sentiment in reference to Mr. Dimmesdale was expressed by a person whose eccentricities, or insanity as we should term it, led her to do what few of the townspeople would have ventured on, to begin a conversation with the wearer of the Scarlet Letter in public. It was Mistress Hibbins, who, arrayed in great magnificence with a triple ruff, a broidered stomacher, a gown of rich velvet, and a gold-headed cane, had come forth to see the procession. As this ancient lady had the renown, which subsequently cost her no less a price than her life, of being a principal actor in all the works of necromancy that were continually going forward, the crowd gave way before her, and seemed to fear the touch of her garment as if it carried the plague among its gorgeous folds. Okay, so now we have another character. Mistress Hibbins has come in to the scene, and she is headed right for Hester. She's striking up a conversation, something that no one else is willing to do. But you'll remember that Mistress Hibbins, our narrator has told us repeatedly, was a suspected witch. Now, I always have students say, well, why hasn't she been put to death? Why haven't they killed her if that's what they did? Well, it has to do with the fact that she's the governor's sister. And that probably is what saved her, at least for a while. The narrator does tell you that she was put to death after our story at some point. But the fact that she was the governor's sister probably protected her, because Hawthorne is repeatedly trying to point out just how hypocritical the Puritans were. That would be another example. Seen in conjunction with Hester Prynne, kindly as so many now felt towards the latter, the dread inspired by Mistress Hibbins was doubled and caused a general movement from that part of the marketplace in which the two women stood. Now, what mortal imagination could conceive it? Whispered the old lady confidentially to Hester. Yonder divine man, that saint on earth, as the people uphold him to be, and as I must needs say, he really looks. Who now, that saw him pass in the procession, would think how little while it is since he went forth out of his study, chewing a Hebrew text of scripture in his mouth, I warrant, to take an airing in the forest. Aha, we know what that means, Hester Prynne. But truly, forsooth, I find it hard to believe him the same man. Many a church member saw I, walking behind the music, that has danced in the same measure with me when somebody was fiddler, and it might be an Indian powwow or a Lapland wizard changing hands with us. That is but a trifle when a woman knows the world. But this minister, couldst thou surely tell, Hester, whether he was the same man that encountered thee on the forest path? Madam, I know not of what you speak, answered Hester Prynne, feeling Mistress Hibbins to be of infirm mind, yet strangely startled and awe-stricken by the confidence with which she affirmed a personal connection between so many persons, herself among them, and the evil one. It is not for me to talk lightly of a learned and pious minister of the world like the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale. Fie, woman, fie! Cried the old lady, shaking her finger at Hester. Dost thou think that I have been to the forest so many times, and have yet no skill to judge who else has been there? Yea, though no leaf of the wild garlands which they wore while they danced be left in their hair, I know thee, Hester, for I behold the token. We may all see it in the sunshine, and it glows like a red flame in the dark. Thou wearest it openly, so there need be no question about that. But this minister? Let me tell thee in thine ear. When the black man sees one of his own servants signed and sealed, so shy of owning to the bond as is the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale, he hath a way of ordering matters, so that the mark shall be disclosed in open daylight to the eyes of all the world. What is it that the minister seeks to hide with his hand always over his heart? Ha, Hester Prynne? What is it, good Mistress Hibbins? Eagerly asked little Pearl. Hast thou seen it? No matter, darling, responded Mistress Hibbins, making Pearl a prolonged reverence. Thou thyself wilt see it one time or another. They say, child, thou art of the lineage of the Prince of the Air. Wilt thou ride with me some fine night, to see thy father? Then thou shalt know wherefore the minister keeps his hand over his heart. Laughing so shrilly that all the marketplace could hear her, the weird old gentlewoman took her departure. Okay, so we're going to point out a couple things that Mistress Hibbins helped us with. First of all, she notices the change, and much like the conversation she had with Dimmesdale right after he returned from the forest, she tells Hester that she knows he was there, and that Hester was there too. How would she know this? Well, it has to do with the fact that if she's a witch, that means that she's made a deal with the devil, or that she does the devil's work. Sorry. And so that's how she knows. Kind of like Chillingworth just knows some of those things. The devil has a way of getting certain knowledge, and apparently that's what we see here. She also points out many a church member saw I walking behind the music that has danced in the same measure with me when somebody was fiddler. So my question is, well, who plays the fiddle? Because notice somebody is capitalized. This would be a reference to the devil, right? The devil plays the fiddle. I don't know if you realize that that was a legend before the song, The Devil Went Down to Georgia, but that was actually a thing, right, that they believed. So according to Mistress Hibbins, a lot of the church members that she just saw go through in the procession, she has danced with them when the devil was playing the fiddle. So this implies that those eminent men, the important, honorable men of the town, have had their own dealings with the devil. So Hawthorne's telling us again that the hypocrisy doesn't just stop with Hester. It's all over the place with the Puritans. And then Pearl chimes in. I'm tired today. Pearl chimes in, and she wants to know if Mistress Hibbins knows why the Reverend keeps his hand over his heart. And Hibbins tells her, don't worry, you'll know for yourself. You'll see it yourself soon enough. And then she says, they say thou art of the lineage of the Prince of the Air. Wilt thou ride with me some fine night to see thy father? She's not talking about Dimmesdale. She's talking about the devil. The Prince of the Air would be the devil. And so remember that Pearl has been questioned as being a devil child repeatedly throughout the book. That's what Hibbins is referring to. By this time, the preliminary prayer had been offered in the meeting house, and the accents of the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale were heard commencing his discourse. An irresistible feeling kept Hester near the spot. As the sacred edifice was too much thronged to admit another auditor, she took up her position close beside the scaffold of the pillory. It was in sufficient proximity to bring the whole sermon to her ears in the shape of an indistinct but varied murmur and flow of the minister's very peculiar voice. Okay, so the sermon has started. Hester is standing where? Not in the church because it's too full. Hester can't or doesn't fit in there. So that could be taken literally. She can't fit in there because it's crowded. But it also makes sense because she's an outcast. She doesn't fit in the church. This vocal organ was in itself a rich endowment, insomuch that a listener, comprehending nothing of the language in which the preacher spoke, might still have been swayed to and fro by the mere tone and cadence. Like all other music, it breathed passion and pathos and emotions high or tender, in a tongue native to the human heart, wherever educated. Muffled as the sound was by its passage through the church walls, Hester Prynne listened with such intentness and sympathized so intimately that the sermon had throughout a meaning for her entirely apart from its indistinguishable words. These, perhaps, if more distinctly heard, might have been only a grosser medium and have clogged the spiritual sense. Now she caught the low undertone, as of the wind sinking down to repose itself, then ascended with it as it rose through progressive gradations of sweetness and power until its volume seemed to envelop her with an atmosphere of awe and solemn grandeur. Okay, so just to make sure you're on track, Hester's standing near the scaffold, which isn't too far from the church, the meeting house, so she can hear Dimmesdale's voice. She can't make out the words he's saying, but she can hear the tone and the cadence of his voice. And she's just sort of, based on the feeling that goes with the tone, she is assigning the sermon her own meaning because she doesn't know what he's actually saying. And yet, majestic as the voice sometimes became, there was forever in it an essential character of plaintiveness, a loud or low expression of anguish, the whisper or the shriek, as it might be conceived, of suffering humanity that touched a sensibility in every bosom. At times, this deep strain of pathos was all that could be heard and scarcely heard, sighing amid a desolate silence. But even when the minister's voice grew high and commanding, when it gushed irrepressibly upward, when it assumed its utmost breadth and power, so overfilling the church as to burst its way through the solid walls and diffuse itself in the open air. Still, if the auditor listened intently, and for the purpose, he could detect the same cry of pain. What was it? The complaint of a human heart, sorrow-laden, perchance guilty, telling its secret, whether of guilt or sorrow, to the great heart of mankind, beseeching its sympathy or forgiveness at every moment, in each accent, and never in vain. It was this profound and continual undertone that gave the clergyman his most appropriate power. Okay, so according to this, Dimsdale's tone, no matter how loud or powerful or commanding he gets, his tone or his voice always has an undertone of pain in it, of anguish, like like it's the sound of the human heart that is maybe trying to tell a secret. During all this time, Hester stood statue-like at the foot of the scaffold. If the minister's voice had not kept her there would nevertheless have been an inevitable magnetism in that spot whence she dated the first hour of her life of ignominy. There was a sense within her there was a sense within her, too ill-defined to be made a thought, but weighing heavily on her mind, that her whole orb of life, both before and after, was connected with this spot, as with the one point that gave it unity. Little Pearl, meanwhile, had quitted her mother's side, and was playing at her own will about the marketplace. She made the somber crowd cheerful by her erratic and glistening ray, even as a bird of bright plumage illuminates a whole tree of dusky foliage by darting to and fro, half seen and half concealed amid the twilight of the clustering leaves. She had an undulating, but oftentimes a sharp and irregular movement. It indicated the restless vivacity of her spirit, which today was doubly indefatigable in its tiptoe dance, because it was played upon and vibrated with her mother's disquietude. Whenever Pearl saw something to excite her ever-active and wandering curiosity, she flew thitherward, and, as we might say, seized upon that man or thing as her own property, so far as she desired it, but without yielding the minutest degree of control over her motions in requital. The Puritans looked on, and if they smiled, were none the less inclined to pronounce the child a demon offspring from the indescribable charm of beauty and eccentricity that shone through her little figure and sparkled with its activity. She ran and looked the wild Indian in the face, and he grew conscious of a nature wilder than his own. Thence, with native audacity, but still with a reserve as characteristic, she flew into the midst of a group of mariners, the swarthy-cheeked wild men of the ocean, as the Indians were of the land, and they gazed wonderingly and admiringly at Pearl, as if a flake of sea foam had taken the shape of a little maid, and were gifted with a soul of the sea fire that flashes beneath the prow in the night time. So Hester is still standing by the scaffold, and Pearl is off playing in the crowd. The Puritans watch her. They might smile, but they are also willing to pronounce her a demon offspring. So they still think she kind of seems like an evil little child. She interacts with the Indians as well as the sailors, because you see Pearl interacting with these wild attendees, right? Those who are wilder than the rest. They see Pearl as one of them. This is very similar to the scene earlier in the book when Pearl was said to be kindred spirits with the forest creatures, the animals, because they were both wild at heart. So this kind of mimics that. One of these seafaring men, the shipmaster, indeed, who had spoken to Hester Prynne, was so smitten with Pearl's aspect that he attempted to lay hands upon her with the purpose to snatch a kiss. Finding it as impossible to touch her as to catch a hummingbird in the air, he took from his hat the gold chain that was twisted about it and threw it to the child. Pearl immediately twined it around her neck and waist with such happy skill that once seen there, it became a part of her, and it was difficult to imagine her without it. "Thy mother is yonder woman with the Scarlet Letter," said the seaman. "Wilt thou carry her a message from me?" "If the message pleases me, I will," answered Pearl. "Then tell her," rejoined he, "that I spake again with the black-visaged, hump-shouldered old doctor, and he engages to bring his friend, the gentleman she wots of, aboard with him, So let thy mother take no thought save for herself and thee. Wilt thou tell her this, thou witch baby? Mistress Hibbins says my father is the prince of the air, cried Pearl with a naughty smile. If thou callest me that ill name, I shall tell him of thee, and he will chase thy ship with the tempest. Pursuing a zigzag course across the marketplace, the child returned to her mother and communicated what the mariner had said. Hester's strong, calm, steadfastly enduring spirit almost sank at last on beholding this dark and grim countenance of an inevitable doom, which, at the moment when a passage seemed to open for the minister and herself out of their labyrinth of misery, showed itself with an unrelenting smile right in the midst of their path. With her mind harassed by the terrible perplexity in which the shipmaster's intelligence involved her, she was also subjected to another trial. There were many people present from the country round about, who had often heard of the Scarlet Letter, and to whom it had been made terrific by 100 false or exaggerated rumors, but who had never beheld it with their own bodily eyes. These, after exhausting other modes of amusement, now thronged about Hester Prynne with rude and boorish intrusiveness. Unscrupulous as it was, however, it could not bring them nearer than a circuit of several yards. At that distance they accordingly stood, fixed there by the centrifugal force of the repugnance which the mystic symbol inspired. The whole gang of sailors, likewise observing the press of spectators, and in learning the purport of the Scarlet Letter, came and thrust their sunburnt and desperado-looking faces into the ring. Even the Indians were affected by a sort of cold shadow of the white man's curiosity, and gliding through the crowd, fastened their snake-like black eyes on Hester's bosom, conceiving perhaps that the wearer of this brilliantly embroidered badge must needs be a personage of high dignity among her people. Lastly, the inhabitants of the town, their own interest in this worn-out subject languidly reviving itself by sympathy with what they saw others feel, lounged idly to the same quarter and tormented Hester Prynne, perhaps more than all the rest, with their cool, well-acquainted gaze at her familiar shame. Hester saw and recognized the self-same faces of that group of matrons who had awaited her forthcoming from the prison door 7 years ago, all save one, the youngest and only compassionate among them, whose burial robe she had since made. At the final hour, when she was so soon to fling aside the burning letter, it had strangely become the center of more remark and excitement, and was thus made to sear her breast more painfully than at any time since the first day she put it on. So, all these people who are visiting, who have heard of the Scarlet Letter but haven't seen it for themselves, they're all looking at Hester. They're all walking around staring at her. And then the Indians and the sailors, they come and they look. And even the townspeople who know good and well what the letter looks like, or they've seen it 100 times, even they seem to be staring at her all over again. It says that this is the worst she has felt about wearing the letter since she put it on 7 years ago when she was on the scaffold. This chapter, this whole last section of the book, you see a lot of things mimicked that have happened earlier in the book. You see them come full circle or be repeated in some form. While Hester stood in that magic circle of ignominy, where the cunning cruelty of her sentence seemed to have fixed her forever, the admirable preacher was looking down from the sacred pulpit upon an audience whose very inmost spirits had yielded to his control. The sainted minister in the church, the woman of the Scarlet Letter in the marketplace. What imagination would have been irreverent enough to surmise that the same scorching stigma was on them both? Right, so we see a stark contrast between Dimmesdale and Hester here at the end. While he's in the church, in the pulpit, while everyone's looking up to him and listening to him and doing whatever he says, Hester is standing out there in the marketplace, feeling shame and punished, which has been, again, the case throughout the book, but especially at the beginning of the story when she was on the scaffold the first time. A quick recap of the chapter. You have the procession, and in the procession, we know that Dimsdale's changed, both in body and spirit. He looks invigorated, he looks energetic, but he also seems to be focused on his thoughts, and he doesn't seem to notice anything else around him. Hester and Pearl both notice the change, struggling to believe that he's even the same man. Mistress Hibbins comes into the scene. She says the same thing. Would you believe that it's the same guy? And hence, again, that Dimsdale has made a deal with the devil. During Dimsdale's sermon, Hester's standing outside the meeting house near the scaffold, and Pearl's running around the crowd, playing and interacting in different ways, especially with the more wild attendees, including the ship's captain. They kind of see her as one of them because she is a more wild spirit. And that pretty much covers the chapter.